On a warm summer afternoon in August 1628, thousands of people lined the harbour of Stockholm to watch the launch of the most powerful warship their nation had ever built. Cannons were loaded for a ceremonial salute. Flags snapped in the breeze. Somewhere in the crowd, families waved off husbands, fathers and sons, setting sail on what should have been a routine journey to a naval anchorage just a few miles away. 20 minutes later, that same ship was lying on the bottom of the harbour, and dozens of people who had been standing on its deck moments earlier were dead in the water. Have you ever wondered how a nation could pour a fortune into a single ship, one meant to be the pride of an entire kingdom, only to watch it sink before it had even left sight of the crowd that came to celebrate it? It's the kind of story that sounds almost too dramatic to be real, and yet every detail of it is documented in surviving court records, eyewitness testimony, and the ship herself, still sitting today, exactly where curious visitors can walk around her and see the very flaw that sank her. This is the story of the Vasa, and it remains one of the most spectacular engineering failures in maritime history. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to understand the pressure Sweden was under at the time. In the 1620s, King Gustav II Adolf was locked in a brutal, drawn-out war with Poland-Lithuania, fighting for control of Baltic trade routes and, more personally, defending his throne against a rival cousin who still claimed it belonged to him. Naval power wasn't just a matter of pride for Sweden, it was survival. Whoever controlled the Baltic Sea controlled the flow of trade, troops, and supplies that decided the outcome of the entire war. Gustav needed a fleet capable of intimidating his enemies before a single shot was fired, and he needed it fast. Sweden at this point was still a relatively young naval power compared to established maritime nations like the Dutch Republic, England and Spain, all of whom had decades or centuries more experience building large, ocean-worthy warships. To close that gap quickly, Sweden turned to foreign expertise, importing skilled shipwrights from the Netherlands, one of the most advanced shipbuilding centres in the world at the time, and setting them to work in Stockholm's Royal Shipyard. In 1625, the king ordered a set of new warships from a Stockholm shipyard, run by a Dutch-born master shipbuilder named Henrik Hibertsson. Among them was a vessel that would eventually be named Vasa, after the royal house of Vasa that Gustav belonged to. From the very beginning, this wasn't meant to be an ordinary ship. It was meant to be a floating political statement, a warning to Sweden's enemies, and a symbol of the crown's power carved directly into wood and bronze. The final result was staggering for its time. The Vasa stretched over 200 feet from bow to stern and stood as tall as a 4- or 5-story building above the waterline. She carried 64 bronze cannons arranged across 2 full gun decks, an arrangement that was, at the time, a genuine innovation in naval architecture, allowing a single ship to fire devastating broadsides that older single-deck warships simply couldn't match. But firepower wasn't the only priority. Every available surface above the waterline was covered in elaborate carved sculptures, lions, biblical figures, mythological warriors, and royal symbols, all painted in vivid gold, red, and blue. The ship wasn't just built to fight, it was built to be seen, to announce Sweden's ambitions to anyone watching from the shore or from a rival ship's deck. To picture the scale of the decoration alone, imagine covering the entire exterior of a 5-story building in gilded carvings, each one individually sculpted by hand, then multiplying that effort across hundreds of separate figures wrapping around the bow, stern, and gunwales. Master carvers worked for months alongside the shipbuilders, producing lions with bared teeth, warriors in classical armor, and cherubs bearing the royal coat of arms, all intended to be visible and unmistakable from a considerable distance across open water. Contemporary accounts describe the total cost as consuming roughly 5% of Sweden's entire gross national product for that year, an almost unthinkable share of a nation's wealth, to sink into a single vessel, particularly one intended to spend most of its life sailing directly into cannon fire. To put that in perspective, imagine a modern nation committing the equivalent of a meaningful slice of its entire yearly government budget to a single military vessel, then watching that investment vanish beneath the waves before it had traveled the length of a few city blocks. Building something this ambitious meant pushing well past what Swedish shipbuilders had ever attempted before. And partway through construction, the project took a turn that, in hindsight, set the entire disaster in motion. King Gustav, eager to maximize the ship's firepower and impress rival navies, personally intervened and ordered a second, fully armed gun deck added to the design, on top of specifications that had originally called for a single deck. The problem was that construction had already begun. The ship's hull width, its ballast requirements, and its center of gravity had all been calculated around the original, lighter design. Adding an entire second deck of heavy bronze cannons meant piling significant weight high above the waterline without correspondingly widening the hull or adding enough ballast low in the keel to compensate. Nobody at the time fully grasped just how dangerous that imbalance would turn out to be, because naval architecture in the 1620s hadn't yet developed reliable mathematical methods for calculating a ship's stability. Shipbuilders worked largely from experience and proportion, from rules of thumb passed down through generations, not formal engineering calculations. And no one alive had ever built anything quite like what Gustav was now demanding. To make matters worse, the original shipbuilder, Henrik Heibertsson, fell seriously ill partway through construction and died before the Vasa was finished, leaving his assistant to complete a project whose fundamental design had already been altered midstream by royal order. There was no single person left who fully understood the original calculations well enough to recognize just how badly they had been thrown off balance by the added weight above. As construction neared completion, there were warning signs, and they weren't subtle. Before the Vasa's official launch, the ship's own crew conducted an informal stability test, ordering 30 sailors to run back and forth across the deck in unison to see how much the ship would rock. Modern accounts of the test describe the ship tilting so dramatically after just a few passes that the ship's captain, watching in visible alarm, ordered the exercise stopped before someone was thrown overboard. Vice Admiral Claes Fleming, who witnessed the test, reportedly acknowledged the ship's instability but did nothing to delay the launch. The political pressure to deliver the King's flagship on schedule during an active war outweighed the caution any individual engineer or officer might have wanted to exercise. Nobody wanted to be the person who told Gustav his prized warship wasn't ready. At the time, the king himself was away from Stockholm, personally leading his forces in Poland, issuing orders and demanding progress reports by letter, entirely disconnected from the physical reality unfolding at the shipyard back home. Distance and political urgency combined to create exactly the kind of pressure that makes it easiest for warning signs to be quietly set aside rather than confronted directly. On the afternoon of August 10th, 1628, the Vasa set sail from Stockholm harbour for the first and only time. The crowd gathered along the shore to watch included ordinary Stockholm residents, foreign dignitaries, and members of the court, all eager to see the kingdom's most magnificent warship begin her maiden voyage. Aboard were roughly 150 people, a mix of experienced sailors and, remarkably, a number of wives and children who had come along to enjoy the short celebratory journey to the fleet's anchorage point. Onlookers packed the shoreline and nearby rooftops, some having traveled considerable distances specifically to witness the launch of a ship they had heard described for months, in taverns and marketplaces across the city, as the most powerful vessel Sweden had ever produced. The ship fired a ceremonial salute as she pulled away from the dock, her sails catching the wind for the very first time. Almost immediately, a gust of wind caught her broadside, and the Vasa began to heel sharply to port. For a moment, she seemed to right herself, drawing what must have been a collective, relieved breath from the crowd on shore. Then, a second, stronger gust struck, and this time the ship kept tilting further and further, until the open gun ports on her lower deck, positioned dangerously close to the waterline to accommodate all that extra firepower, dipped beneath the surface. Water poured directly into the hull. There was no recovering from that. Within minutes, the Vasa rolled onto her side and sank, disappearing beneath the harbour's surface roughly 1,300 meters from where she had departed, in full view of the very crowd that had gathered to celebrate her. The disaster unfolded so quickly that many aboard had no chance to escape. Somewhere between 30 and 50 people died in the sinking, drowned in the harbour, or trapped below deck as the ship went down, including several of the women and children who had come along purely for the festivities. It's a detail that's easy to lose in the drama of the engineering failure itself. Real families, invited for what should have been a proud and joyful afternoon, paid for a design flaw with their lives, in water shallow enough that survivors could see the mast still sticking up above the surface as they swam for shore. The explanation for why the Vasa capsized so catastrophically and so quickly comes down to a problem of basic physics that no amount of skilled sailing could have overcome. The ship's center of gravity sat far too high above her center of buoyancy, a direct consequence of stacking a second heavy gun deck onto a hull that had never been widened or ballasted to support it. In simple terms, imagine trying to balance a tall, top-heavy tower on a narrow base. It doesn't take much of a push to send the whole structure toppling over. The Vasa's crew hadn't done anything wrong in how they handled the ship. There was no navigational error, no misjudged course, no failure of seamanship at all. The ship was, by design, unable to survive even a moderate gust of wind the moment her lower gun ports touched water. It was a flaw baked into her structure from the very first shipwright's calculations, invisible to the naked eye and completely unforgiving once exposed. The Vasa is often remembered today as history's original maiden voyage disaster, but it's worth noting she wasn't the last. Nearly 300 years later, the Titanic would suffer a very different kind of catastrophe on her own maiden voyage, one caused by an iceberg rather than a design flaw. Yet the two disasters share an unsettling similarity. Both were flagship vessels, built at enormous expense, launched amid public celebration and national pride, and lost within days or even minutes of setting out for the very first time. History seems to repeat a particular lesson every few centuries, that the more a ship is built to symbolize power and prestige, the more pressure exists to launch it on schedule, regardless of who raises concerns along the way. In the aftermath, Sweden needed someone to blame for a disaster, this public and this humiliating for the crown. The ship's captain, who survived the sinking, was arrested almost immediately and thrown into custody while a formal inquiry got underway. Over the following weeks, the Swedish Council of the Realm interrogated shipwrights, officers, and crew members, trying to determine exactly who was responsible for launching a ship that, in hindsight, so many people involved in her construction seemed to have quietly suspected wasn't seaworthy. Ultimately, the investigation concluded that the ship had been built according to specifications approved by the king himself, and no one was formally punished. It was, in its own quiet way, an early example of a disaster where everyone involved understood the risk on some level, and nobody felt they had the standing to stop it. Think about what that failure actually cost Sweden at the time. This wasn't simply the loss of a ship, it was the loss of roughly 5% of the nation's entire annual economic output, sunk in a harbour before it had fired a single shot in anger, during a war where naval strength was directly tied to the kingdom's survival. In modern terms, using the scale of a national economy today, that kind of proportional loss would represent hundreds of millions, potentially edging toward $500 million in value for a single vessel, an almost incomprehensible sum to lose in 20 minutes. For a kingdom already stretched thin by years of continuous warfare, it was a wound that went far beyond wounded pride. For more than 3 centuries afterward, the Vasa essentially disappeared from history. Most of her valuable bronze cannons were salvaged from the wreck not long after the sinking, using primitive diving equipment lowered from the surface, and once that recovery effort was complete, interest in the wreck faded entirely. The ship settled into the mud at the bottom of Stockholm harbour and was largely forgotten, buried under decades and then centuries of silt, known only through old records and folk memory, rather than any physical trace anyone could point to. That changed in the 1950s when a Swedish naval historian and amateur researcher named Anders Franzén became fascinated by the old records describing the Vasa's sinking and began systematically searching the harbour for any trace of the wreck. After years of painstaking surveys, dragging core samples up from the harbour floor, Franzén finally located the remains of the ship in 1956. What followed was a delicate, multi-year salvage operation, carefully tunneling underneath the hull to thread supporting cables through the mud without damaging the fragile wooden structure above. In April 1961, the Vasa was finally raised back to the surface, 333 years after she sank, in front of a watching crowd almost as large as the one that had seen her disappear centuries earlier. The salvage operation itself was a remarkable feat of mid-century engineering in its own right. Navy divers, working in near-total darkness in the murky harbour water, spent months tunneling 6 separate passages underneath the buried hull by hand, carefully threading thick steel cables through each tunnel so the ship could be lifted evenly without the fragile timber snapping under its own weight. The vessel had to be raised in careful stages, pontoon by pontoon, resting in shallower water for months, while conservators began the delicate work of stabilizing waterlogged wood that had spent over 3 centuries, slowly absorbing the harbor's brackish water. What divers and archaeologists found waiting beneath the waves stunned the maritime world. The cold, low-oxygen, low-salinity waters of the Baltic Sea had done something remarkable. They had preserved the ship's wooden hull almost perfectly, protecting it from the shipworms that typically destroy sunken wooden vessels within decades in saltier waters elsewhere in the world. Roughly 98% of the ship that emerged from Stockholm harbour in 1961 was original material, an almost unheard-of survival rate for a wooden vessel that old, one that continues to astonish maritime archaeologists and conservators to this day. Alongside the hull, archaeologists recovered thousands of artifacts, frozen in time from the moment of the sinking: tools, clothing, personal belongings, even skeletal remains of some of the crew members and passengers who never made it to shore. Today, the Vasa sits fully restored and on permanent display inside a purpose-built museum in Stockholm, one of the most visited museums in all of Scandinavia. Since her recovery, more than 45 million people have walked through the doors to see her, drawn not by a legendary naval victory or a heroic story of survival, but by the sheer spectacle of an almost perfectly preserved 17th-century warship, standing as a monument to one of history's most dramatic engineering failures. There's a particular irony sitting at the heart of this story that's hard to ignore. The Vasa was built to project unstoppable power, to intimidate enemies before they ever exchanged fire with Sweden's navy, to be remembered as a symbol of the kingdom's strength for generations. In a strange way, she achieved exactly that, just not remotely in the way anyone intended. Instead of striking fear into rival fleets on the open sea, she became one of the most studied cautionary tales in the history of engineering, a case still taught in naval architecture and design courses today as an example of what happens when political ambition overrides technical caution. Modern engineers studying stability, structural loading, and design review processes often point directly to the Vasa as an early lesson in a problem that still shows up in project failures centuries later. The danger of altering a design mid-construction without fully recalculating how every other part of the system will be affected. It's a pattern that echoes well beyond shipbuilding into aviation, construction, and any large engineering project where the pressure to finish on time competes directly with the discipline required to finish safely. The specific technology has changed almost beyond recognition since 1628, but the underlying human dynamic, ambition, outrunning caution, someone noticing a problem but not feeling empowered to stop the project, has proven remarkably difficult to engineer away entirely. So was the Vasa a failure, or did she simply take 333 years longer than expected to fulfill her purpose? A ship meant to dominate the Baltic for decades, instead spent centuries silently buried in mud, only to resurface as one of the best preserved artifacts from the entire age of sail, more valuable today as a piece of history than she ever could have been as a warship. The next time you see a grand, ambitious project rushed forward under pressure, with warning signs quietly waved away because nobody wanted to be the one to slow it down, remember the Vasa. Sometimes the most expensive lesson in engineering history is the one that sinks in full view of everyone watching and takes centuries to finally be understood.